On the 26th of December 2004, the second largest earthquake ever recorded on a seismograph, between 9.1 and 9.3 in magnitude, took place under the Indian Ocean off the western coast of Sumatra. Over 8 minutes in duration, the quake was also the longest lasting, as well as the 8th deadliest natural disaster ever recorded. It triggered a number of tsunamis that became known in some parts of the world as the Asian tsunami and in others as the Boxing Day tsunami. Following the sudden vertical rise of the seabed, the waters receded from the shores of such countries as Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka and Thailand, and then poured back in with devastating effects. Like all tsunamis, the phenomenon behaved very differently in shallow water than it did in deep water. Far out at sea, the waves moved quickly and were small and hardly noticeable. But the massive displacement of water in the shallows nearer the shoreline slowed the tsunami's speed considerably and resulted in a succession of huge waves, which rolled inland in roughly 30-minute cycles. The third was the biggest and the most cataclysmic, with waves up to 30 meters high destroying towns and villages and traveling up to 2 kilometers inland. The force of the waves was calculated to be the equivalent of 5 megatons of TNT. That's over twice the entire explosive force used during all of the Second World War, including the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 1,600-kilometer fault line stretched from north to south, so the waves with the greatest impact were the ones traveling to the east and west. This meant that countries like Bangladesh, which is a low-lying country at the northern end of the Bay of Bengal, and therefore quite near to the quake's epicenter, reported only 2 deaths after the capsize of a tourist boat. Other countries are not so lucky, and distance was no guarantee of safety. Somalia, 4,500 kilometers away on the northeastern coast of Africa, lost nearly 300 people, and a further 5,000 were displaced. The worst-hit country was Indonesia. While exact numbers of casualties are impossible to gauge, original estimates put the number of deaths at around 170,000. Although in 2005, the Indonesian health minister updated that total to 220,000. In the northern provincial capital of Banda Aceh, one of the hardest hit areas, there were 30,000 deaths. The casualties in India, Thailand and Sri Lanka also numbered in the thousands, with the overall estimated loss of life near to 300,000 and within the vicinity of 1.7 million people losing their homes. Unable to resist the force of the water, children made up at least a third of the casualties, while relief agencies reported that 4 times as many women were killed as men, as they waited on beaches for their fishermen husbands to return. Tourists also suffered badly, with Europe particularly affected. Sweden and Germany confirmed over 500 deaths each. Amongst those dead were 14-year-old Lucy Holland, the granddaughter of English film director Richard Attenborough, and the fashion photographer Simon Attlee. Brazil lost its diplomat, Luis Ameo de Benedicto Davola, who, with her young son, died in Phi Phi, Thailand. Amongst all the horror, though, there were some amazing stories of courage, resilience, and quick thinking. Before the tsunami hit northern Phuket in Thailand, a 10-year-old British schoolgirl called Tilly Smith spotted the warning signs of the receding ocean and, remembering her geography lessons, alerted her parents to the danger. They raised the alarm and everyone on the beach was safely evacuated. Because the effects of the disaster were felt on such a global scale and the news images were so horrifying, the amount of aid sent to the stricken areas was unprecedented, amounting to $7 billion. But the physical, psychological and political ramifications were so profound that while relief was swift and for the most part well orchestrated, the recovery process will stretch on for decades. The largest attack submarine ever built, the Russian K-141 Kursk, was laid down in 1992 and launched 2 years later. 154 meters long and 4 stories high, she had a diving depth of between 300 and 600 meters. The sub was commissioned as part of the Russian Northern Fleet and was the last of the Oscar II-class submarines designed and built in the Soviet era. In August 2000, the Kursk set out on a dummy torpedo drill, along with 3 other attack subs, the fleet's flagship, Peter the Great, and some smaller ships. At 11:28 local time on the 12th of August, the Kursk fired the first of its dummy torpedoes at the flagship. But there was an explosion. The cause is the subject of much debate. Was it due to defects in the experimental torpedo? Or was it in fact the result of a collision with another sub, possibly a foreign vessel, as many believe? The explosion measured 2.2 on the Richter scale and caused the Kursk to sink over 100 meters to the bottom of the Barents Sea. A second explosion, twice as powerful as the first, occurred a couple of minutes later. Though most of the submarine's crew were killed outright in those first 2 explosions, 23 of the 118 crew members aboard survived in compartment 9, the one furthest away from the blasts. But despite rescue attempts from British and Norwegian naval teams, these men could not be reached in time and also died. While Russian authorities tried to claim that their survival was brief, notes found on the body of Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov suggested that he and his men had hung on for hours. Also found in compartment 9 were potassium superoxide chemical cartridges, which are used to absorb carbon dioxide and chemically release oxygen. This suggests the crew members had survived for several days before a flash fire used up the rest of the oxygen, leading to death by asphyxiation. The badly damaged ship was eventually salvaged by a Dutch team in 2001, which cut off the bow during the process. All the bodies were recovered and finally laid to rest. The 11th of May 1985 was supposed to be a day of celebration for the Bradford City Football Club, as it marked the English team's triumph as winners of the 3rd Division trophy. Instead, it is a day that is now remembered by the citizens of the town as one of horror, as 54 of the team's supporters and 2 fans of the visiting Lincoln City side were killed as fire swept through the Valley Parade football stadium. Another 450 were injured, half of them requiring hospital treatment. Many of the others were helped by members of the local British Asian community, who immediately opened up their homes around the ground and rushed to help. Knowing that their team had already won the 3rd Division Championship, Bradford City's fans had turned out in great numbers for the match. The 11,076-strong crowd was double the average attendance for the season. The fire started 40 minutes into the match, with the score standing at 0-0. A pile of rubbish beneath the stand was accidentally ignited by a discarded cigarette, and the fire took hold rapidly, with spectators being moved onto the playing field to escape the flames. Those at the rear of the 77-year-old wooden stand, however, were trapped by inward opening exit doors and locked turnstiles, and were quickly overcome by the toxic smoke. The number of deaths would have been even greater if it hadn't been for the actions of those who had already escaped the fire. 28 police officers and 22 supporters were publicly recognised as having saved at least one life and later received bravery awards. An inquiry into the fire also led to new laws to improve safety at UK football grounds. There was a ban on the building of wooden grandstands, and the Valley Parade Stadium of today is very different to the one of 1985, with only the clubhouse and one flank support wall of the original structure remaining. And every year at the 11th hour of the 11th day of May, a memorial service is held by the City Hall, followed by a minute's silence to remember those who lost their lives. Located in the Cascade Range and part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, the active stratovolcano Mount St. Helens in Skamania County, Washington, may look peaceful enough now, but climbers have learned not to be complacent where it is concerned, knowing that at any time its trails may again be closed to them, like they were after the 18th of May 1980. The volcano's most infamous eruption, causing the deaths of 57 people and 7,000 big game animals, was the deadliest volcanic activity ever in the United States. It was also the most economically destructive event of its kind, with the loss of 250 homes, plus the destruction of bridges, roads and railway tracks. An earthquake 2 months earlier had started the seismic activity, leading to a 5.1 magnitude quake on the 18th of May. The massive eruption saw the entire north face of the mountain collapse, and the resulting debris avalanche was the biggest in recorded history. When it was all over, the mountain's summit had been reduced by 400 meters to 2,550 meters. In the years since the 1980 eruption, the mountain has continued to change. It was initially left to return to its natural state, but was reopened to climbers by the National Forest Service in 1987. 7 years later, it was again closed when magma reached the volcano's surface in early October. In March 2005, the mountain spewed out a plume of steam and ash, soaring 11,000 meters into the sky, that could be seen from Seattle. Archaeological surveys point to human settlement around Mount St. Helens for the past 6,500 years and numerous volcanic events. Are we due for an even bigger eruption than the one of May 1980? Only time will tell. This is the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. It was here at 6:01 on the evening of the 4th of April 1968 that the Baptist minister and civil rights movement leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was shot in the throat.
Boys and white girls and sisters and brothers, I have a dream today.
He was pronounced dead little more than an hour later at St. Joseph Hospital. King is one of the most loved and revered figures in recent American history. In his lifetime and posthumously, he was the recipient of numerous awards and prizes. In 1964, at the age of 35, he became the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. One of the main reasons King received such recognition was because, like Mahatma Gandhi before him, he espoused the philosophy of non-violent civil disobedience. This sometimes led to conflict with other African American leaders who believed in more direct means of protest. Malcolm X called the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom the farce on Washington, when its original focus on the desperate conditions faced by African Americans in the South was altered. King was one of the central figures who capitulated to President Kennedy's desire to make the march less strident in tone. In the end, the march was still a great success, with more than 250,000 attending. As news of King's death spread, there was a wave of riots in some 60 cities across America. On the 9th of April, 5 days after the shooting, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a national day of mourning. The crowd who attended his funeral on the same day numbered 300,000 and included politicians like future President Richard Nixon and JFK's younger brother, Senator Bobby Kennedy, who would himself be cut down by an assassin's bullet only 2 months and 2 days later. During King's funeral, his close friend Mahalia Jackson sang his favorite hymn, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," and the eulogy was given by the man himself. A recording was played of his noted drum major sermon from the 4th of February 1968, in which he requested that his honours should not be recalled, but that he had tried to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and love and serve humanity. King's influence and prestige has only grown in the years following his assassination. Every year on the 3rd Monday of January, close to his birthday on the 15th, America celebrates Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a public holiday. It was a sweltering hot night, the 11th of August, 1965. At about 7:45, California Highway Patrolman Lee W. Minicus pulled over Marquette Fry at the corner of 116th and Avalon in the Watts area of Los Angeles on the suspicion of drunk driving. When Fry's mother, Rena Price, and her stepson, Ronald, tried to intervene, they were also arrested. A crowd gathered, and before long there was a full-scale riot underway. Many of those involved, though, would describe it differently, however, and the subsequent investigation, the McCone Commission, found deeper causes for the widespread burning of buildings, looting, and deaths. Despite the progress forged by the civil rights movement, many black Americans faced terrible poverty, inequality, and racial discrimination. In Los Angeles, there was particular resentment about the passage of Proposition 14 on the California ballot in November 1964. This had overturned the earlier Rumford Fair Housing Act, a law passed to give black people equal opportunity when it came to buying homes. During the 6 days of rioting, 34 people, most of them African American, were killed, and more than 1,000 were injured. 4,000 were arrested. More than 600 buildings were destroyed, with white-owned businesses specifically targeted. The damage bill was estimated to be in the region of $35 million. Eventually, martial law was declared, and the National Guard moved into the area. Initially, 2,000 troops from the 160th Infantry and a squadron of the 18th Armoured Cavalry were mobilized. They were followed 2 days later by the rest of the 40th Armoured Division, and the next day by more troops from Northern California. In all, the National Guard presence numbered 15,000 men. They put a cordon around a large area of South Los Angeles, and the rioting was all but over by the Sunday night. After the riots, the government response was minimal, and little effort was made to address the problems or repair the damage. And it is probably no coincidence that the radical organization, the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense, formed in the state the following year. One of the most chilling sights of the 20th century, the mushroom cloud formed by an atomic explosion. It was a sight seen frequently at Bikini Atoll in the Republic of the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958, when the United States conducted more than 20 nuclear weapons tests in the area. Admiral William F. Halsey Jr., or Bull as he was known, oversaw operations as his old warship, the Independence, was one of those selected as a target vessel for the tests. Tagged the Pacific Proving Grounds, the bomb testing area saw the first detonation on the 1st of July 1946 in Operation Crossroads. The idea of using ships as targets instead of detonating the bombs on land was to see what the effect atomic weapons would have on naval fleets. And the plane carrying the bombs was loaded with livestock, including goats, sheep, and mice, again to see what effects the blast and resulting radiation would have on the animals. Unfortunately, the Americans were similarly cavalier in their treatment of the indigenous people of the area. In 1954, Castle Bravo, the US's first dry-fuel hydrogen bomb and its largest weapon ever detonated, turned out to be twice as powerful as predicted and cast its nuclear fallout far and wide. Islanders were quickly evacuated, but exposure to radiation left many of them with cancers and abnormally high rates of birth defects. The first bomb, given the moniker Able, had a yield of 21 kilotons and was dropped from an altitude of 158 meters. Surprisingly, Able didn't sink the Independence, nor did the second test, another 21 kiloton bomb dubbed Baker, which was actually detonated underwater at a depth of 27 meters on the 25th of July 1946. Baker did cause a massive condensation cloud, however, which spread a huge amount of radioactive water onto the ships. The badly contaminated Independence was subjected to further tests at Pearl Harbor before finally being scuttled off the coast of San Francisco in 1951. He's been dead for over 3,300 years, and yet his image is still instantly recognizable. The Egyptian boy king Tutankhamun ruled from 1333 BC to 1324 BC until his death at the age of only 18. This early demise meant for years historians wondered whether he'd been murdered, but a CT scan in 2005 suggested the most likely cause was gangrene following a badly broken leg. There's a good reason to believe he was not a significant or particularly memorable ruler, but since the discovery of his tomb, he has become perhaps the most famous of all ancient Egyptian figures. The reason for this is simple. When British Egyptologist Howard Carter and his team entered the tomb in November 1922, they found it to be almost completely intact, one of the richest and best preserved sites ever uncovered in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. And in all likelihood, this was a direct result of Tutankhamun's fall from prominence. Sealed up and forgotten, the tomb had even suffered the indignity of having some workers' cottages constructed over its entrance. The excavation of the site was long and painstaking. It was 8 years until the last objects were removed from the tomb. Even today, there remain rumours of a curse attached to the site, with people taking a macabre delight in tales of early deaths suffered by those who entered the tomb. Researchers indicated, though, that there is no statistical difference in dates of death between those in the original party who entered and those who did not. Indeed, most involved saw their 70th birthday. But why let truth get in the way of a good story? The history of the boy with the golden mask and the stunning artifacts found around him in death have now fascinated the world for nearly a century. The blockbuster touring exhibition, Treasures of Tutankhamun, which began at the British Museum in 1972, capitalised on that interest and was an enormous success. It has since been followed by more recent exhibitions, like 2005's Tutankhamun and the Golden Age of the Pharaohs. When this particular tour finishes in Egypt in 2008, it is expected that 3 million people will have seen it. Perhaps that's why he's still smiling. He's enjoying the irony. It wasn't just the place, but the day itself that was infamous for King Alexander I of Yugoslavia. Having had 3 of his family members die on a Tuesday, he usually made it a rule not to carry out any public functions on that day of the week. On Tuesday, the 9th of October 1934, however, the 45-year-old dictator was forced to make an exception. That was the day he arrived in Marseille in the south of France on the Yugoslav Navy destroyer, the Dubrovnik. He was making a state visit and hoping to strengthen an alliance between the two countries. He was met by the French Foreign Minister, Louis Barthou. As the king and Barthou drove through the streets, a gunman emerged from the crowd and shot both Alexander and the chauffeur dead. Barthou was also shot, but by a French policeman reacting to the confusion. He died later. The assassin was Vlado Chernozemski, the driver of the leader of the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. The remarkable footage of King Alexander's death, with the cameraman right on the spot as it happened, makes this one of the most historic early newsreels. And it wasn't only Alexander's death that was captured on film. His killer, Chernozemski, was cut down by the sword of a French mounted policeman. He was then attacked by the crowd and also killed. Alexander's body was returned home on the Dubrovnik. He was buried at the Memorial Church of St. George, which had been built by his father, before eventually being transferred to a mausoleum in Beograd, as his will stipulated. Yugoslavia was then ruled by a regent, Prince Paul, until the signing of the tripartite pact with the Nazi-led Axis powers in 1941.